Hi, what's poppin'? It's your boy Big Rich, Queens, New York City, where we get busy. Monday evening business. Ladies and gentlemen, come on in. Wipe your feet on the rug. Throw some smoke in the atmosphere. I just lit up some Atomic Star Dog. Let's get right into business. This next story coming out of Cosa Nostra News by my man Ed Scarpo. Salute to you, Ed, and let's get right into it. Patriarca family boss Cadillac Frank Salemme loses life sentence appeal for murder of nightclub owner. A federal appeals court in Boston upheld the life sentences of New England Cosa Nostra boss Francis Cadillac Frank Salemme and mob associate Paul Weadick for the 1993 murder of Steven DiSarro, a federal witness whose remains were found in an unmarked grave in Rhode Island in 2016. According to federal prosecutors, Salemme, 88, held a secret interest in a South Boston nightclub called the Chanel, which DiSarro purchased. Salemme had DiSarro killed after he began to believe that the nightclub owner was talking to the FBI and was about to implicate him in criminal activity. The Fed's star witness at Salemme and Weadick's 2018 trial was Stephen the Rifleman Flemme, a longtime partner of Winter Hill boss Whitey Bulger. Flemme, 84, who is serving a life sentence for 10 murders, he had walked in on the Salemmes, father and son, and Weadick, 66, who were in the process of murdering DiSarro. The First U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals in Boston affirmed the jury's 2018 verdict, finding Salemme and Weadick guilty of killing DiSarro. Fueling the appeal was the admission at trial of a large amount of evidence concerning the prior criminal activities of Salemme and several witnesses, according to the appeals court ruling. Quote, Weadick complains, among other things, that by trying him jointly with Salemme and then introducing evidence covering 3 decades of crimes by Salemme, the government deprived him of a fair trial. Salemme, in turn, argues that much of that evidence about his past was inadmissible hearsay or propensity evidence. U.S. Circuit Judge William Kayata, writing for the 3-judge panel, rejected the appeal claims and noted that the evidence met the standard that it needed to meet. He also rejected Weadick's claims about being deprived of a fair trial because he had been alongside Salemme. Mark Shea, Weadick's lawyer, promised a further appeal, saying that his client was wrongfully convicted. As for the background of the murder charge, according to a court filing from the U.S. District Court for the District of Massachusetts in 1992, DiSarro bought a shuttered nightclub in Boston with funds that Frank Jr. gave him. This was because at the time, DiSarro was under investigation and the papers listed DiSarro's stepbrother as the owner. Frank Jr. was kept on the books as a part-time manager, which allowed him to avoid a full curfew as a condition of pre-trial release following his arrest on labor racketeering charges. Weadick, a close friend of Frank Jr., was hired as a night manager. Weadick and Frank Jr. had a history of ripping off drug dealers together, knowing that the specter of the New England Cosa Nostra, or also known as the NELCN, would deter any retaliation. In March of 1993, a federal agent approached DiSarro, telling him that he was under investigation and asking him to cooperate. Upon hearing this news, Salemme voiced concern that DiSarro would implicate Frank Jr. and eventually Salemme himself. Weadick expressed similar concerns to Frank Jr. Around the same time, Frank Jr. and Salemme also told others that they suspected DiSarro of stealing from the nightclub. Having trouble getting a meeting with DiSarro, Weadick and Frank Jr. discussed inviting him to Salemme's house to make him feel safe. Soon thereafter, DiSarro was approached by another federal agent who told him he had been indicted and for the second time asked him to cooperate with the government. DiSarro reported this contact to both his stepbrother, who nominally owned the club, and his wife. The next morning, DiSarro's wife watched him get into a car she didn't recognize, but her description of the vehicle matched a car Frank Jr. sometimes used. She never saw her husband again. Over 20 years later, a Rhode Island excavator who had been charged with committing various offenses led law enforcement officials to a location in Rhode Island where they unearthed DiSarro's remains. Forensic examination revealed that DiSarro had been strangled. The excavator's information also led to Robert DeLuca, a captain in the New England LCN, who confessed that he had received DiSarro's body from Salemme's with order to dispose of it. DeLuca reported that he had heard from Salemme that Weadick had driven DiSarro to Salemme's house, where Frank Jr. strangled DiSarro and Weadick held his legs, all in Salemme's presence. DeLuca's information provided the breakthrough law enforcement had been looking for investigating DiSarro's disappearance. Eventually, the government initiated this case by indicting Salemme and Weadick for murdering DiSarro with the intent, at least in part, to prevent him from talking to federal authorities. Frank Jr. had died by the time the charges were filed. At trial, Flemmi testified that he walked in on DiSarro's murder at Salemme's house as it was happening, just as DeLuca described it. Weadick's girlfriend at the time of the murder testified that she had overheard Weadick and Frank Jr. expressing concerns that DiSarro had a big mouth right before the murder. She also reported that Weadick left her apartment shortly thereafter and was in an agitated state when he returned. He gave her a man's bracelet and told her that she would not need to worry about seeing DiSarro again. Later, as they were driving south of Boston, Weadick told her that a location that they had passed would be a good place to bury a body. After 23 days of trial, the jury found both defendants guilty. Once again, salute Ed Scarpa for a very informative story. Let me know what you're smoking on. Let me know what city you're smoking in. And we will talk soon. Salute.